The people who change history are rarely the ones anyone notices. In the spring of 1944, in a small farming village outside Augsburg, Germany, nobody noticed Anna Keller. At 22 years old, she rose before sunrise every morning, long before church bells echoed across the valley. While most of the village still slept beneath quilts and heavy blankets, Anna was already outside, carrying a metal pail through damp grass silvered by the morning dew. The air smelled of earth, wood smoke, and the promise of rain. Chickens scratched lazily near the fence line. A milk cow shifted its weight inside the barn. Somewhere beyond the rolling fields, a train whistle drifted through the cold dawn air. Life moved slowly here, quietly, predictably. Anna preferred it that way. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. She kept her blonde hair tied back beneath a faded scarf and spent most days helping her father keep their modest farm running while the war consumed the rest of Europe. To the people around her, there was nothing remarkable about her. She was not the mayor's daughter. She was not a teacher. She was not a nurse. She was not someone whose name carried weight in town meetings or Sunday gatherings. She was simply Anna, the farm girl, the girl who carried feed sacks, the girl who repaired fences, the girl who sold eggs at the market every Saturday morning. Good worker, some would say. Quiet girl, others would add. Then the conversation would move on. Few people ever looked twice. Fewer still wondered what she thought when she stood alone at the edge of the fields watching clouds move across the Bavarian sky. The war had changed many things, but not how people saw Anna. Young men had left for military service. Families waited for letters that arrived less often with every passing month. Store shelves grew thinner. Coffee became harder to find. Sugar became precious. Yet somehow, Anna remained nearly invisible. Even at the market, where villagers gathered to exchange news and rumors, she often stood quietly behind baskets of potatoes and fresh vegetables while louder voices filled the square. That particular Saturday morning, an elderly farmer named Otto Weber laughed as he loaded supplies into his wagon. If the chickens ever learned to run the farm themselves, he joked, Anna might finally get a day off. Several people chuckled politely. Anna smiled. Nothing more. She had learned long ago that people often confused silence with simplicity. They assumed that because she did not argue, she did not think. Because she did not boast, she lacked confidence. Because she stayed in the background, she had nothing important to offer. The truth was far more complicated. But Anna never felt the need to explain herself. She simply continued her work. As the afternoon sun drifted lower over the fields, golden light stretched across the valley. Wind moved gently through rows of wheat. A hawk circled overhead. Children chased one another along a dirt road near the church. It seemed like an ordinary day, the kind of day that would be forgotten by morning. Yet high above those peaceful fields, beyond the clouds no one bothered to watch, fate was already moving toward the village. And before another sunrise arrived, the quiet farm girl nobody noticed would become the one person a wounded stranger desperately needed. The next morning arrived beneath a ceiling of low gray clouds. The air felt heavier than usual, carrying the scent of approaching rain across the valley. Anna Keller stood near the chicken coop repairing a loose section of fencing while a cool breeze moved through the wheat fields beyond the barn. The village was quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. She paused for a moment and looked toward the sky. Nothing. Only clouds drifting slowly eastward. Then she returned to her work. A few miles away, farmers guided horses through damp fields. Women hung laundry beside cottages. Children walked home from lessons carrying books beneath their arms. It seemed like another ordinary day in a place largely untouched by the chaos consuming distant cities. But shortly after noon, a new sound entered the valley. Faint at first, barely noticeable, a distant hum carried on the wind. Anna straightened slowly. The sound grew louder. She was not the only one who noticed. Across the village, heads tilted upward. Doors opened. Conversations stopped. The hum became a roar. Engines. Aircraft. More than one. The noise rolled across the countryside like approaching thunder. Villagers stepped into the streets. Farmers shaded their eyes. Children pointed toward the clouds. High above the valley, small silver shapes emerged between breaks in the overcast sky. They moved fast. Faster than anything on the ground. Anna watched from beside the fence, her heart suddenly beating harder. Aircraft were not unusual during the war. They had crossed the region before. Most passed overhead and disappeared toward distant destinations. But something felt different this time. The sound carried urgency, motion, tension. One aircraft separated from the others. At first it seemed intentional. Then it drifted lower, much lower. Several people noticed it immediately. An older farmer, standing near the road, frowned. The aircraft no longer moved with the steady confidence of the others. It dipped slightly, corrected, dipped again. The engine noise changed. Even from miles away, something sounded wrong. The silver aircraft emerged beneath the clouds. For one brief moment, sunlight reflected from its wings. Then a trail of dark smoke appeared behind it. Gasps spread through the village. Children stopped pointing. Adults stopped speaking. Everyone watched. The aircraft continued losing altitude. Not rapidly, not dramatically, but enough to make the situation impossible to ignore. Anna felt a knot form in her stomach. The pilot was trying to keep control. That much was obvious even from the ground. The aircraft crossed above the valley, passing over church steeples and farmhouses. The engine sputtered unevenly. Then came silence. Not complete silence. The wind still moved through the trees. A dog barked somewhere near the square, but the engine itself suddenly vanished. The absence felt enormous. The aircraft glided forward without power. Every eye followed it. Anna stepped away from the fence. The aircraft disappeared briefly behind a ridge covered with pine trees west of the village. A few seconds later, a distant sound echoed through the hills. Not an explosion, more like the heavy crack of timber breaking deep within the forest. Then nothing. Absolute stillness. No engine. No movement. No second sound. Only silence settling over the valley once again. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then voices erupted everywhere at once. Questions. Speculation. Fear. People pointed toward the forest. Some hurried toward the village center. Others returned inside their homes. Anna remained where she stood, staring toward the distant ridge. Somewhere beyond those trees, an aircraft had come down. Somewhere beyond those trees, a pilot might be waiting. And while the rest of the village debated what had happened, a feeling she could not explain began pulling her toward the forest. Anna did not tell anyone where she was going. By the time most villagers had gathered near the square to exchange theories and warnings, she had already crossed the first pasture west of her family's farm. The grass brushed against her boots as she moved quickly toward the pine-covered ridge. Above her, the clouds continued drifting across the afternoon sky. The air smelled of damp earth and crushed leaves. Somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the trees, lay the aircraft everyone was talking about. The farther she walked, the quieter the world became. The voices of the village faded behind her. Soon only the wind remained. It whispered through branches and carried the distant creak of swaying pines. Anna followed a narrow path used occasionally by woodcutters. Fallen needles softened each step. Moss covered stones along the forest floor. Several times she stopped and listened. Nothing. Then she continued. After nearly 30 minutes, she noticed the first sign. A broken branch hanging at an unnatural angle. 20 yards farther, another. Then pieces of metal scattered among ferns and brush. Small fragments. Twisted but recognizable. Her pace slowed. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the clouds, creating shifting patches of silver across the ground. Then she saw it. Beyond a stand of pines, partially hidden between trees, rested the remains of the aircraft. It had come down among a clearing bordered by tall evergreens. One wing lay angled against the earth. The fuselage was scarred and weathered from its descent through the forest canopy. Yet remarkably, much of the aircraft remained intact. Anna stood still for several seconds. Her heart hammered inside her chest. She had never been this close to a military aircraft before. Everything about it felt enormous. Foreign. Unreal. She took a cautious step forward. Then another. The wind moved through the clearing. A loose section of metal rattled softly. Otherwise, there was only silence. She told herself there would be no one inside. Surely soldiers would already be gone. Surely the pilot had escaped or been found. Yet something kept drawing her closer. She reached the edge of the clearing and stopped again. That was when she heard it. Not a voice. Not a shout. A faint sound. Barely audible. A slow breath. Anna froze. Her eyes scanned the aircraft. For a moment she wondered if she had imagined it. Then she heard it again. Weak. Uneven. Human. The pilot was still there. Every instinct told her to turn back and get help. Yet another thought arrived immediately afterward. Help from whom? Most of the village remained miles away. Even if someone agreed to come, precious time would pass. Anna moved carefully toward the aircraft. Inside the cockpit sat a man in a worn flight jacket. His head rested against the seat. His eyes were closed. Dust covered his uniform. One hand remained loosely draped near the controls. He looked young, younger than she expected, not much older than 30. His face was pale from exhaustion. For a long moment, she simply stared. This was not a faceless enemy from newspaper headlines. This was a person, alone in a forest, far from home. The pilot opened his eyes slightly, just enough to reveal that he was still conscious. Their gazes met for less than a second. Then his eyes closed again. Anna swallowed hard. She understood immediately what that brief glance meant. He was alive, but only barely. And somewhere behind her, back in the village, people were already deciding that a stranger like him was not worth saving. Anna remained beside the cockpit for several seconds, listening to the man's breathing. The sound was faint but steady. That alone gave her hope. A cool wind moved through the clearing, carrying the scent of pine sap and damp soil. Above the treetops, clouds drifted slowly across the afternoon sky. Everything around her seemed strangely calm, as if the forest itself had not yet realized what had happened. She looked back toward the direction of the village. It was nearly 3 miles away. Even walking quickly, it would take time to reach it. Then there would be questions, arguments, delays. She already knew what many people would say. Leave him there. Let the authorities handle it. Wait for soldiers. Wait for someone else. But as she turned back toward the pilot, she understood something simple. Someone else was not here. She was. The man's eyes opened briefly once more. They seemed unfocused, exhausted. He tried to speak, but no words came. Only a shallow breath. Anna knelt beside the aircraft and studied him carefully. She was not a doctor. She knew that. Yet she could see enough to understand that he needed shelter, water, and help as soon as possible. Waiting alone in the forest would solve nothing. She glanced around the clearing. About 50 yards away stood an old forestry shed abandoned years earlier by woodcutters. Its roof sagged slightly, but the structure still stood. Dry, hidden, protected from wind and rain. A difficult journey under normal circumstances. An enormous challenge now. Anna removed her work gloves and slipped them into her coat pocket. Then she climbed carefully onto the side of the aircraft and reached for the pilot. He felt heavier than she expected. Taller too. His flight jacket smelled faintly of engine oil, smoke, and cold air. For a moment, she wondered if moving him was a terrible mistake. Then she remembered the clouds gathering overhead. Rain was coming. She could not leave him where he was. Slowly, patiently, she helped him out of the cockpit. Every movement took effort. Several times she had to stop and catch her breath. Pine needles crunched beneath her boots. The pilot drifted in and out of awareness, barely conscious of what was happening. Yet each time she paused, she could still hear him breathing. That sound became her guide. Step by step, yard by yard, they moved across the clearing. The distance felt far longer than 50 yards. Her shoulders ached. Her hands trembled from strain. The afternoon light began fading behind thickening clouds. At one point she nearly slipped on wet moss and both of them almost lost balance. She steadied herself against a fallen log and continued. Finally they reached the shed. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and dust. Sunlight filtered through narrow gaps between weathered boards. Anna cleared a space near the far wall and gathered several burlap sacks left behind years earlier. They would have to do. Carefully she helped the pilot settle onto them. For the first time since finding him, she allowed herself to sit down. Her breathing was heavy. Her arms felt weak. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the hills. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The pilot remained unconscious. Yet his breathing sounded slightly stronger than before. Anna looked at the stranger for a long moment. Somewhere beyond the forest, people were deciding what should happen to him. But here, inside the quiet shelter, a different decision had already been made. She was not going to leave him. Rain continued through most of the evening. Water drummed softly against the roof of the abandoned shed while wind moved through the surrounding pines. Inside, the small shelter remained dim and cool. Anna sat beside the unconscious pilot, listening carefully to each breath. The forest beyond the walls seemed distant now. The world had narrowed to a single question. How could she keep him alive until morning? For a long time she simply watched him. His face appeared younger in the fading light. Not much older than her older brother had been before the war took him away. A lock of damp hair rested across his forehead. His flight jacket was worn from months of service. His hands were rough. Working hands. Human hands. Not the hands of a monster. Not the image described in wartime posters hanging throughout the village. Anna reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded handkerchief. She dipped it into a small tin cup filled with rainwater collected from a leak near the doorway. Carefully, she placed the cool cloth against the pilot's forehead. His breathing remained uneven. Yet after several minutes, he seemed calmer. The simple act stirred an old memory. Suddenly, she was 12 years old again, standing inside her family's kitchen. Her mother sat beside a neighbor suffering from a fever. The room smelled of herbs and fresh bread. Outside, summer rain tapped against the windows. People forget how much healing comes from patience, her mother had said while replacing a damp cloth on the woman's forehead. Anyone can panic. Helping requires calm. Anna remembered those words perfectly. Her mother had never been a trained nurse. Yet she possessed knowledge passed down through generations. Remedies. Practical care. The kind of wisdom that rarely appeared in books but often made the difference between recovery and decline. Whenever illness swept through the village, people quietly came to her for help. As a child, Anna had watched everything. She learned how to recognize exhaustion, how to reduce fever, how to keep someone comfortable while waiting for strength to return. Most people never knew she had learned any of it. There had never been a reason to mention it. Until now. The rain eased shortly before midnight. Anna left the shed briefly and gathered several medicinal plants growing near the edge of the clearing. Her mother had shown her each one years ago during walks through the countryside. She returned carrying what she needed and carefully prepared a simple herbal infusion using water heated over a small lantern flame. The familiar scent filled the shelter. Earthy, clean, comforting. For the first time since finding the pilot, she felt something close to confidence. Not certainty, never certainty, but purpose. She was no longer reacting. She was helping. Hours passed slowly. Occasionally, the pilot stirred. Once his eyes opened halfway before closing again. Another time he whispered something in English she could not understand. A name perhaps, or a memory. Anna listened but did not interrupt. Outside, clouds finally began to break apart. Moonlight slipped through gaps in the roof and painted pale silver patterns across the wooden floor. The forest seemed peaceful once more. Near dawn, the pilot's breathing became steadier. Not strong, not normal, but improved. Anna noticed the change immediately. She leaned forward and allowed herself a small smile. It was the first hopeful sign she had seen all night. Somewhere beyond the forest, the village still believed Anna Keller was simply a quiet farm girl who sold eggs and repaired fences. None of them knew she was spending the night fighting exhaustion beside a stranger. None of them knew that the lessons her mother left behind were now becoming the difference between despair and hope. And none of them knew that by sunrise, the secret she had carried quietly for years would begin changing everything. The second day proved harder than the first. Dawn arrived beneath clear skies, but the sunlight brought little comfort. Anna had not slept more than a few minutes at a time. Every sound from the pilot drew her attention. Every change in his breathing made her pause and listen. The forest awakened around them. Birds called from the treetops. Squirrels moved through the branches overhead. Somewhere in the distance, an axe struck wood with a hollow rhythm. Life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Inside the shed, however, time seemed to move differently. The pilot remained weak. His eyes opened occasionally, only to close again moments later. Once he looked directly at Anna, confusion visible in his expression. He seemed to realize he was no longer inside the aircraft. Yet exhaustion quickly pulled him back into silence. Anna continued her quiet routine. Fresh water, cool cloths, careful observation, patience. The same lessons her mother had repeated countless times. By midday, the forest air had become warm and heavy. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the wooden walls, drawing golden lines across the floor. The pilot stirred more frequently now. Several times he attempted to sit up. Each attempt ended after only a few seconds. He lacked the strength. Frustration appeared briefly on his face before fatigue replaced it. Anna understood the feeling. Recovery was rarely dramatic. It arrived slowly, one small improvement at a time. Still, the day tested her resolve. Shortly after noon, voices echoed faintly through the trees. Men from the village. Searching. Their words carried through the forest on the breeze. Anna froze. The pilot remained asleep, unaware. She moved quietly to the doorway and listened. The voices grew louder for a moment, then faded again. The searchers had chosen another direction. Relief washed through her. Not because she feared her neighbors, but because she knew what would happen if they found him now. The discussion would end before it began. Decisions would be made. Control would pass to others. She looked back at the sleeping pilot. He deserved the chance to recover before strangers decided his future. As afternoon turned toward evening, dark clouds returned to the horizon. The air became cooler. A light rain began shortly before sunset. The sound reminded Anna of the previous night. She sat beside the pilot while drops tapped softly against the roof. The rhythm felt calming. Familiar. Safe. Then something changed. The pilot opened his eyes again. This time they remained open. He stared at the ceiling for several seconds before slowly turning his head. His gaze settled on Anna. Unlike before, there was awareness behind his eyes. Recognition. He knew someone was there. Neither of them spoke. The silence lasted nearly half a minute. Finally, he managed a few quiet words in English. Anna did not understand most of them. Only one stood out. Water. The request was simple. Human. She immediately handed him a cup. His hands trembled as he accepted it. He drank slowly, then looked at her again. Gratitude required no translation. For the first time since the aircraft came down, hope felt real. Not because he was fully recovered. Far from it. The difficult days were not over. But a door had opened. The stranger was no longer a distant responsibility. He was becoming a person with a voice, a story, and a future. And Anna realized that somewhere between the storm, the long night, and the quiet hours of waiting, she had stopped wondering whether he would survive and started believing that he could. The following morning arrived clear and bright. Sunlight filtered through the pine branches and painted shifting patterns across the floor of the shed. For the first time since the aircraft had come down, the forest felt peaceful. Anna had stepped outside at dawn to collect fresh water from a nearby stream. When she returned, she immediately sensed something had changed. The pilot was awake. Not briefly. Not for a few seconds. Fully awake. He sat against the wall with a blanket draped over his shoulders, watching the sunlight move across the doorway. His face still showed exhaustion, but there was strength in his eyes now. Awareness. Curiosity. Relief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Anna set down the water bucket and quietly entered the shed. The pilot studied her carefully. She could almost see him trying to understand what had happened. The last thing he likely remembered was the sky, the aircraft, the forest rushing upward. Now he found himself inside an abandoned shelter with a stranger who had spent days caring for him. Finally, he placed a hand against his chest and spoke slowly. James. His voice remained rough but clear. James Carter. Anna understood immediately. He was introducing himself. She nodded, then placed a hand lightly against her own chest. Anna. The pilot smiled faintly. Anna. He repeated her name carefully, making certain he pronounced it correctly. It was a small moment. Simple. Yet somehow it changed everything. The stranger now had a name. So did the person who had saved him. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker tapped rhythmically against a trunk. The ordinary sounds of the forest filled the silence between them. Over the next hour, they exchanged a handful of words. Most communication happened through gestures. Neither spoke the other's language well enough for conversation. Yet understanding arrived anyway. James pointed toward the forest and then toward the sky. Anna nodded. He pointed toward himself and made the shape of an airplane with his hand. Again she nodded. Neither needed many words to understand the basic story. At one point, James glanced around the shed and frowned slightly. He seemed puzzled by where he was. Anna motioned toward herself, then pointed toward the distant clearing where the aircraft rested. James stared at her for several seconds. Slowly, the realization appeared on his face. She had brought him here. Alone. The idea seemed impossible to him. He looked toward the doorway, estimating the distance. Then back at Anna. Then toward the forest again. Finally, he shook his head and laughed softly in disbelief. The reaction surprised her. Yet she understood it. Most people would not have expected someone like her to accomplish such a thing. James certainly had not. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer. Not with admiration. Not yet. More with astonishment. He had likely imagined being rescued by soldiers, medics, or trained professionals. Instead, he had awakened to find that his survival depended entirely upon a quiet farm girl hidden deep within the Bavarian countryside. Later that afternoon, as sunlight stretched long across the forest floor, James managed to stand for the first time. Only briefly, only with support. Yet it was enough. Anna remained nearby as he steadied himself. The effort left him tired, but smiling. Progress. Real progress. As evening approached, they sat near the doorway watching golden light filter through the trees. Neither spoke much. Neither needed to. James looked out across the forest and then back toward Anna. In that quiet moment, one truth became impossible to ignore. The person everyone would have overlooked had become the reason he was still alive. On the fifth morning, the forest no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt almost like a temporary home. Sunlight poured through the trees in wide golden beams. The air carried the scent of pine, wild grass, and warming earth. Anna arrived shortly after sunrise carrying a basket filled with bread, apples, and fresh water from the farm. As she stepped into the clearing, she immediately noticed something different. James was standing outside the shed. Not for a few seconds. Not with support. Standing on his own. One hand rested lightly against the wooden wall, but his posture was steady. When he saw her, a smile appeared across his face. It was the strongest she had seen since finding him. Anna smiled back. Progress had become visible now, no longer measured only through breathing or brief moments of awareness. It could be seen in every step he took. Yet while recovery continued inside the forest, questions were growing beyond it. Back in the village, people had begun noticing Anna's absences. She left early, returned late, sometimes carrying supplies she could not fully explain. At first, nobody paid much attention. Then curiosity slowly became suspicion. During a busy afternoon at the market square, two neighboring farmers discussed it openly while unloading sacks of potatoes. One claimed he had seen footprints leading toward the western ridge. Another mentioned hearing voices in the forest. A third insisted someone must have survived the aircraft incident. Rumors spread quickly in small villages. By evening, nearly everyone had heard a different version of the same story. The next day, Otto Weber stopped by the Keller farm. He found Anna repairing a gate beside the pasture. The old farmer leaned against the fence and studied her carefully. "You spend a lot of time in the woods lately," he remarked. Anna continued working. "Sometimes." Otto nodded slowly. "People are talking." She tightened a loose bolt and said nothing. Silence often encouraged others to reveal more than questions did. Otto glanced toward the distant ridge. If someone survived that crash, the authorities will find them eventually. For a moment, Anna paused. Then she returned to her work. The conversation ended there, but the words stayed with her throughout the day. Meanwhile, James continued growing stronger. Their conversations remained simple, a mixture of gestures, scattered words, and shared observations. Yet understanding deepened with every passing hour. One afternoon, he pointed toward the farm basket she carried, and then mimed milking a cow. Anna laughed and nodded. Another time, she pointed toward the sky and made a rough flying motion with her hand. James smiled and pretended to steer an airplane. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet both found themselves laughing afterward. Human connection required less language than either had expected. Several days later, everything changed. A group of villagers entered the forest searching for firewood. Their path brought them closer to the clearing than anyone had come before. Anna saw them first. 3 figures moving between the trees. Their voices drifted faintly through the branches. James noticed her expression immediately. The laughter disappeared. The reality of their situation returned. They stood silently inside the shed while the villagers passed nearby. Close enough to hear. Close enough to discover everything. Then, slowly, the voices faded. The danger passed, but the moment left its mark. Secrets rarely remained hidden forever. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the forest in shades of gold and amber, Anna realized the truth would eventually reach the village. The question was no longer whether people would learn what she had done. The question was how they would react when they discovered that the quiet farm girl they barely noticed had accomplished something none of them thought possible. The truth reached the village sooner than Anna expected. It happened on a cool morning when autumn sunlight washed across the valley and the first hints of gold appeared among the trees. A group of foresters traveling through the western ridge spotted movement near the abandoned shed. By afternoon, the story had spread from farmhouse to farmhouse. By evening, nearly everyone knew. The quiet girl from the Keller farm had spent days caring for the American pilot who survived the aircraft crash. Some reacted with surprise, others with disbelief. A few refused to believe it at all. Yet facts have a way of standing quietly while rumors exhaust themselves. The next morning, several villagers followed the forest path and saw the truth with their own eyes. James Carter stood outside the shed beneath the pine trees. Thin, tired, recovering, alive. And beside him stood Anna, calm as ever. The same young woman they had passed at the market for years without a second glance. Nobody knew quite what to say. Otto Weber removed his cap and stared at her for several seconds. "You carried him here?" he finally asked. Anna nodded. "Alone?" Again she nodded. The old farmer looked toward James and then back at Anna. For perhaps the first time in his life, he seemed unable to find words. Others arrived throughout the day. Some brought food. Others brought blankets and supplies. Not because their opinions had changed overnight, but because they now saw something they had missed before. Character, courage, quiet determination. The qualities had always been there. They had simply failed to notice them. A week later, arrangements were made for James to return safely to Allied authorities operating farther west. By then he could walk without assistance. His strength had returned steadily. On the morning of his departure, the valley lay beneath a sky so clear it seemed endless. The air smelled of harvested wheat and wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. James stood beside a military transport vehicle waiting near the edge of the village. Several townspeople gathered nearby. Anna remained slightly apart from the crowd, as she always had. James walked toward her slowly. In one hand, he carried a small notebook. During his recovery, he had spent hours writing in it whenever he could. He held it out to her. Inside, on the first page, he had written a simple message in careful German. His handwriting was imperfect, but the meaning was clear. "Thank you for saving my life." Anna looked up. James smiled. Then he pointed toward the words and gently shook his head. The message was not enough. Some things could not fit on a page. They stood there quietly for a moment while the wind moved through the trees lining the road. Finally, James placed a hand over his heart. No translation was necessary. Then he climbed into the vehicle. The engine started. The truck disappeared down the road and eventually vanished beyond the hills. Years passed. The war ended. Life moved forward. Children grew up. Farms changed hands. New seasons arrived. Yet one story remained. Visitors occasionally stopped in the village asking about the American pilot and the young woman who had saved him. The people always pointed toward the Keller farm. And when they spoke about Anna, they no longer called her ordinary. Because the valley had learned something important. The people who change lives are not always the loudest. They are not always the most powerful. Sometimes they are the ones nobody notices until the moment the world needs them most. And that was who Anna Keller had been all along.